Okay, here we are again, guys. I'm going to do this next lecture as a review for some of you because some of you have already been through and seen some of these topics, but I think it's important for the sake of kind of reinforcing some of the stuff that's come before and also to ensure that everybody gets all this information to do a lecture on some of the incidents or events involved in confronting the segregation that was occurring in the United States, in particular confrontations that came after the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So this whole lecture series is going to be about the actions taken by civil rights activists to really confront or push back against the social injustices and the violations of their rights after the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So confronting segregation. The first thing that you need to remember is that the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 outlawed segregation. It said that separate was inherently unequal. It called that segregationist policy unconstitutional based on the 14th Amendment. So civil rights leaders were very aware of this. They were aware of the rules that the Supreme Court had now put in place, that they had, read the ruling very carefully, and they were ready to essentially say, now we're going to assert our rights, because they knew that the South and other segregationist or places that were engaged in segregation weren't simply going to just sort of turn around and say, oops, sorry about that. They knew it was going to really involve some confrontation. And so the confrontations really begin to a large scale in Montgomery, Alabama. The Montgomery bus boycott was the first example of a boycott against a segregationist policy in a major American southern city. The photograph that you're looking at right here is a photograph of a woman with her thumb in the air, thumbing a ride. During the Montgomery bus boycott, hundreds of African Americans chose to walk or to use carpools to get where they wanted to go, as opposed to using the Montgomery bus service. Something like 60% of the ridership in the buses in the city of Montgomery were African American. But because of the segregationist policies that had been established under the Jim Crow laws, African Americans were forced to sit in the back of the bus. Now, for many of my students growing up in rural Wisconsin, you don't really have an appreciation. I mean, for you guys, the back of the bus is where you want to be, right? I mean, I go on a field trip and kids want to sit in the back of the bus. The problem is that it's really different in a city bus. When I was in college and I moved to Minneapolis and I started regularly riding a city bus, I immediately got it. Like, oh, this is why people don't want to ride in the back of the bus. Because when you're on a city bus, you're often jumping on and you're jumping off really quickly. The bus is just a vehicle to get you somewhere. It's not a place where you're going to hang out with your friends and, like you guys on long bus trips want to sit in the back of the bus so you're as far away from the teacher as you can get so you can, talk and whatever. But on a city bus, it's different. You want to get on and get off. And so the most coveted seats on buses are the ones that are really close to the doors, and especially to the front door, because you come on, you put your money in, and you sit down. If you have to weave your way back to the back of the bus, that is an inconvenience. And it may sound small to you, but once the Brown versus Board of Education decision had been ruled on, people in Montgomery knew that they could push back against this, that it was no longer going to be supported by federal law. The Montgomery Improvement Society, which is an organization that I mentioned a couple of lectures ago, had already been organizing and developing a strategy. And they came up with this idea that let's boycott. Let's not use the city buses. That's essentially what a boycott is. It's withdrawing your participation or your financial support from a product, an organization, an institution as a way to put pressure on that group to change a certain kind of behavior. So by pulling out their ridership, the hope was that they would be able to get the Montgomery bus system to desegregate their buses. So a woman like this hitching a ride as opposed to taking a bus is essentially sending a message. Rosa Parks is very famous for being the first person to really engage in the Montgomery bus boycott. And, kudos to her and hats off to her. She was an incredibly important part of sparking this Montgomery bus boycott. But I want to clear up a couple myths about Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks, as I've mentioned, some of you have heard me say this before, but it bears repeating. We have this mythology about a lot of our civil rights leaders. We believe that, they were sort of these idyllic creatures, or in Rosa Parks' case, she's often portrayed as this older woman who was a seamstress, and her feet were just so tired she couldn't go to the back of the bus, and so she just snapped. Like one day she just snapped. And this portrayal is not true. It's not a true portrayal. It's a mythology. And we do sometimes like to create these mythical figures because they give us something maybe to aspire to, or they seem sort of like these ultimate people. But in Rosa Parks' case, I think understanding who she was in reality makes her a much more powerful character, because in reality, Rosa Parks was a civil rights activist. She was not some old woman who just got tired one day. She was part of the Montgomery Improvement Society. She had been a secretary for her local branch of the NAACP, and she volunteered to boycott that day. She volunteered to get arrested that day. She made a decision and was an active participant. She was not some passive little old lady. And by the way, she wasn't old. She was in her, gosh, I don't even know how old she was. She was in her 30s, I think. And, you might think that's old, but I certainly don't. And so, again, embracing the reality of these characters as opposed to the mythology, I think makes them much more powerful. Another powerful example of the confrontation of, just to back up really quickly, of course, the Montgomery bus boycott was successful. They successfully got the city of Montgomery to reverse their segregationist policies, and they desegregated the buses. But it took a long time. It took a lot of violence. There was a lot of violence done against the protesters in Montgomery, as was violence used against a lot of these other protesters that we will talk about. In Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, a moderate southern town, Little Rock, Arkansas, the school board decides they are going to do what they know is coming down the pipe. They see that there is this desegregation coming down. They know what the Brown versus Board of Education decision essentially requires them to do. And while they were allowed this gradual approach, it's 1957, right? So we're talking 3 years after Brown. The Little Rock, Arkansas School Board decides we should start now. We'll start now. And so they started by asking the black schools in Little Rock to choose their 10 best students. And those 10 best students would be enrolled at Little Rock Central High School in the fall of 1957. Just 10. Now, Little Rock 9 is what we're referring to. Why not the Little Rock 10? The 10th student actually backed out at the last minute and decided not to participate because everybody knew this was going to be brutal. The photograph that you're looking at right here is one of the most famous photos from the Little Rock 9 incident. These students, as they were attempting to integrate those schools, were heckled, were hit, things were thrown at them, they were harassed. The story of the Little Rock 9 is a story of how dramatic these events became, and how we're talking about 9 kids being enrolled in a high school. But this is how dramatic the events became. The governor of the state of Arkansas refused to allow the students admission. They were turned back on the first day. When they returned on the second day, they were met by the state the state police were barring the students' entrance. It took President Eisenhower to send the 101st Airborne into Little Rock, Arkansas to enforce federal law. Because again, this was federal law. This was the federal courts saying desegregation was the law of the land. And so these students actually, the 9 students who were ultimately enrolled at Little Rock, all had to have guards for the rest of their high school career. They had state troopers, and not state troopers, excuse me, National Guardsmen who followed them around to protect them. And so this violence and the the violence continued. The story of the Little Rock Nine actually in many cases was really sad. Lots of the students actually did not graduate from Little Rock. They pulled out of the high school. A couple of them were expelled for, you know, things that, from my perspective, I think if you looked fairly at the incidents, in one case, one of the girls, one of the Little Rock Nine, dumped a bowl of soup over the head of a white girl in the lunch line, and she was expelled. She claimed that she did it in retaliation for the hateful, racist things that these girls were saying to her in the lunch line, but that didn't matter at this point in the history of Little Rock schools. The students really suffered severely, significantly. So their story really didn't end happily for them as individuals, but for a national story in terms of desegregation, it's a powerful example of what was possible. The next confrontation came in 1960, the next famous confrontation. Remember, little things are happening all over the country, but these are the ones that were sort of like the big newsmakers. And in Greensboro, North Carolina, a group of college students decided to confront the segregation in lunch counters all across the United States. The photograph that you're looking at is of 4 young men in Greensboro, North Carolina, and they are sitting at a segregated lunch counter. This is a time in American history when you couldn't go through and get, fast food very quickly. If you wanted a fast lunch, a lot of people went to these lunch counters, lots of different drugstores and places like that had these lunch counters. But for the most part, they were segregated, and African Americans were not allowed to sit at them. The seats were actually reserved for white people. And again, here is an example of young people confronting the segregationist policies. And it is going to consistently be young people who are going to confront these policies. And in Greensboro, North Carolina, again, these kids faced violence, they faced intimidation, threats, and hundreds of these kids were arrested by local authorities in their attempts, but they kept at it. And as soon as one group of kids was taken off the seats and were arrested, another group would sit down and take their place, and then another and another. And their idea was, we're not afraid to go to jail, and we're not afraid to stand up to this. And their notion was basically to just wear them out, to wear out the police force, to wear out the courts, to wear out a community until people finally just said, forget it, fine. And that's what happened in the lunch counter sit-ins. Communities became exhausted from fighting this fight and ultimately conceded to allow the desegregation of lunch counters in many places. Not everywhere, but in many cities. The next topic started in 1961 with the Freedom Riders. And the interstate travel was an area that the Freedom Riders were focused on. So buses, Greyhound buses, traveled all over the United States. And Greyhound was a bus system that was partially segregated in some parts of the United States and not segregated in other parts. Particularly what they were trying to do was they were trying to confront segregation at the rest stops. If any of you have ever ridden a Greyhound, I've ridden a Greyhound. I don't recommend it, but if you're looking for a cheap way to get from one place to another, it's a way to go. But those buses stop constantly. And at each stop there is like a little lounge in many cities. They have bathrooms. They have maybe a little lunch counter that you can eat at where people sort of stop and rest while they're traveling. And it was in these locations that they were trying to desegregate. They were trying to desegregate the sort of way stations for these interstate bus depots, essentially. Buses from colleges all over the United States, among them the University of Wisconsin-Madison famously sent a couple of buses to participate in the Freedom Rides. They met up in Washington, D.C. The students integrated. You had black kids, you had white kids on these buses, and then they started driving into the South. The photograph that you're looking at is a photo of one of the Greyhound buses as it was bombed. Once the buses got into the South, Local members of the KKK heard of these freedom rides and began to follow them, and in some cases even firebombed the buses in the case of this bus. And as the kids and people riding the buses got off the buses, sometimes they were met by members of the local community who had baseball bats, who had chains, and they were severely beaten. There were a number of really brutal beatings that members of the Freedom Rides took as part of this. I had a high school teacher, Mr. Favel. He was an English teacher at Berlin High School when I was there, and he talked about being a freedom rider. And when he was in college at UW-Madison, he got on a bus, and he told a really eerie story of traveling through the South, and all of a sudden, looking out the window and people on their bus noticing that they were being followed by a group of pickup trucks. And the pickup trucks were getting very close to the back of the bus. And as they got closer, they could see that the pickup trucks were filled. The bed of the pickup truck was filled with men with baseball bats and chains. And as they came by the bus, they started swinging their chains at the side of the bus, busting out windows. Eventually, the tires on their bus were shot out. And he said it was a terrifying circumstance to be in. And that's what many of these freedom riders faced. But again, it was an attempt to confront the segregationist policies and to basically say, you know, we know you can't do this anymore. And they got a ton of media, and that was another component of it. Getting white kids and black kids to ride these buses together, getting the international media to pay attention to it was hugely important. And last on this list of the confrontation was the integration, not just of high schools and elementary schools, but the integration of colleges. And James Meredith is a man who wanted to desegregate the bastion of Southern pride, Ole Miss. This university, it's a very famous university in Mississippi, of course, as well as the South. And James Meredith became the first black man to successfully pursue admission to Ole Miss. And this photograph is of James Meredith and his two of his attorneys. And you can see just in the back, so this is James Meredith in the front on the left. He looks like a young man. His attorney, one of his attorneys on the right. And then the gentleman just behind him is another one of his attorneys. And his name is James Meredith. And James Meredith was a famous civil rights attorney. He fought a lot of civil rights battles, including James Meredith's admission to Ole Miss. But James Meredith's story becomes a tragic story about the lengths to which some segregationists went to actually prevent civil rights leaders from promoting a civil rights agenda and bringing an end to segregation. On the next slide, you can see Medgar Evers there. Medgar Evers was the attorney that represented James Meredith in his successful bid to win admission to Ole Miss. And he was a well-known attorney, well-known by both blacks and by whites, by both civil rights leaders and by Klansmen. And the photograph in the bottom right is a photograph of a man named Byron D. LeBeckwith. And Byron D. LeBeckwith was a local Klansman in Mississippi at the time that Medgar Evers was pursuing this case on behalf of James Meredith. And one night, as Medgar Evers got out of his car, shut the door, walked around to the screen door where his little children were waiting to greet him after his day of work, Byron D. LeBeckwith shot him from a distance with his rifle in front of his little children. Medgar Evers' murder went unprosecuted in the state of Mississippi. This man, this civil rights leader, was murdered in front of his children. And Byron D. LeBeckwith was not shy about bragging about it. In fact, he was well known to have been bragging about it for years, that he was the one who killed Medgar Evers, this famous civil rights leader. It wasn't until the mid-1990s that the state of Mississippi finally pursued Byron D. LeBeckwith as the murderer of Medgar Evers. They prosecuted him, and he went to prison where he died. But it took 30 years to accomplish that because, you could integrate all you wanted, but if hate and segregation and racism is still in the hearts of people who are in charge of the legal system and in charge of government, then things like this still happen. So in Medgar Evers' case, it was quite tragic. I want to talk about one more. One more topic here, and that is something that is a really important part of the next stage of the civil rights movement. So the Brown decision sets up this sort of confrontation with these segregationist laws. But by 1964, the President of the United States, under pressure from civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King, pursues a Civil Rights Act in Congress that was filibustered by Southern senators for 54 days. So for 54 days, the Southern senators in Congress refused to allow the act to come to a vote. They used procedures, they used all kinds of different tricks. But the idea behind this law was that it would outlaw segregation in any public place. It would also insist and be very explicit about the voting rights acts or the voting rights of all African Americans. And so the Civil Rights Act was something that a lot of people who still were angry about the Brown decision and people who still believed in segregation, it was one of those things that they really did not want to see happen. And so they filibustered for 54 days. But because in part of the pressure from Lyndon Johnson, they were able to get the Civil Rights Act passed. This is a photograph of Lyndon Johnson actually nose to nose, very famously using his height and his sort of dominance to pursue this legislation. And he was ultimately successful in getting it passed. And it was that Civil Rights Act of 1964 that Martin Luther King was marching on Washington in March of 1964 to push for. The I Have a Dream speech was a product of this pursuit of passage of the Civil Rights Act. So all those famous moments, where you think of Martin Luther King saying, I have a dream that all God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, that, those famous images, he made that speech and they organized that march because they wanted to see this Civil Rights Act passed. And when it passed, it set up the next sort of stages of the civil rights movement. Okay, that's enough for now. Thank you very much, and all right, we'll see you in the next lecture.